Welcome to today's class. In this lecture, we will study about memory management techniques. In previous classes, you studied how processes can share the CPU and the different resources on the CPU, and that led to better utilization of the resources of the CPU. If more than one process exists in the system, then those processes have to remain in the main memory at one point of time. So when those processes exist in the main memory simultaneously, then memory management needs to be done so that the processes stay in distinct areas, they are protected from each other, and various things like contiguous allocation, performance, and efficiency concerns are taken into account while allocating memory space to those processes. We will look at how these things can be handled in operating systems in this lecture. Let's proceed. So first we will look at some background, and then we will look at what swapping is. Swapping happens when the system runs out of memory and you need to swap one process for another because you cannot keep so many processes in memory at the same time. Then we will look at contiguous memory allocation, because if memory is not allocated contiguously, then programs will find it very difficult to run. So the operating system has to do special things along with the help of hardware to be able to allocate memory to processes contiguously. We will look at two famous mechanisms using which operating systems and the hardware try to allocate memory and manage memory effectively. Those mechanisms are called segmentation and paging. We will look at more details about how page tables are laid out. In the end, we will also talk about how the Intel 32 and 64-bit architectures handle segmentation and paging. We will also take a brief look at the ARM architecture and how it does paging. The objectives of this chapter are to provide a detailed description of how memory hardware organizes memory. We will look at various memory management techniques like paging and segmentation. We will also look at a detailed description of the Intel Pentium way of doing segmentation and paging. And we will also look at how ARM does these things briefly. Let's begin with some background. Programs must be brought from disk into memory, and a process needs to be created from that memory, and then the process gets scheduled on CPUs and they run. So programs usually keep lying on hard disks or other storage media. They do not remain in memory from the beginning. It's only when you want to execute them will they be brought from the disk and put into memory, and they will get scheduled as a process on a CPU and they will run. The CPU can only access the main memory and its registers directly. It cannot access the hard disk directly. There is something called a memory unit which sits tightly between the CPU and the RAM, the main memory. And its job is to take an address, and whether if it's read or write, it reads data from that memory address or it writes data to the memory address. That's its only job. It does not worry about how the memory addresses are created. If you have done architecture before, you will know that there are different ways of addressing. The memory address can come from a register, they can come indirectly from another memory location, they can be the sum of a base register and an index register, they can be literally given in the program. So there are various ways in which addressing can be done. It is none of the business of the memory unit to know how the addresses have been generated. It only needs an address and whether to read or write from it, and that's its only job. When registers are accessed by the CPU, then that can be done in a very speedy manner. Usually within the same clock cycle, the CPU can access one or more registers and work on them. But when it needs something from the main memory, that cannot be done so fast. because the address needs to go to the memory unit, and the memory unit then gives it to RAM, the dynamic memory that you have. And then that takes a very long time to retrieve or store the data and then give the data back or the confirmation that something has been stored or here is the data that you want to be read. That can take a lot of time in comparison with the speed with which CPUs run. So the CPUs usually stall, they don't do anything, they just keep waiting for the data to arrive or the data to be written. That is the reason we put a cache in between the CPU and memory, the main memory. The cache runs very fast. Well, the cache does not run as fast as registers, but it runs pretty fast, way faster than RAM can ever operate. And when the CPU needs something, it first looks into the cache. If it finds it, then it's good. Otherwise, it has to go to the main memory, get the data, put it into the cache, and then use the data. Next time, if it needs the same data, it will directly go to the cache and use it. If more than one processes are there in the system and they have their own memory areas, then we have to make sure that they don't keep interfering in each other's business. If I am a process, then I should only deal within the boundaries of my memory. I should not try to access the memory areas of other processes. Also, the operating system needs to protect its own memory area, because if other processes can trample into the memory areas of the operating system, then they can corrupt that memory area maliciously or otherwise, or viruses can get into that, and then the whole system is compromised. And we cannot let that happen. So let's look at a very simple way in which that protection can be achieved. So that kind of protection can be achieved by using the concept of base and limit registers. So here you can see the operating system has its own area. It usually uses the lower memory addresses because 0 is right here and the memory is increasing in this direction. The operating system is sitting right here in its area, and then here is one process, here is another, and here is yet another process. Each process begins at a certain memory location, and that is given by a base register, and there is a limit until which it can keep accessing, reading or writing memory in that area. So here for this process, as an example, the base is 300040 and the limit is 120900. What does that mean? It can access this address 300040. It can access all the memory addresses between this address and this address plus the limit. This address plus the limit is equal to 420940. Well, this address belongs to the next process. So whatever you get by adding the base and the limit, that is exclusive. That is not included in this process. So all memory addresses, including the base, but excluding the base plus the limit, this entire range, that is fair game. Those are all legal addresses for this process, and it can only access memory regions in that area. So this slide explains that process in a little bit more detail. So the CPU generates an address for a process. It is then checked against the base register. If it is greater than or equal to the base, then you can proceed. Otherwise, a trap is generated and the operating system is asked to handle that trap. Then the base plus limit is computed. And if this address is less than that, as I said, the base plus limit is exclusive. That is not included in the memory region the process can access. So you have to be strictly less than that. If it is yes, then you can go ahead and access memory. Otherwise, again, a trap is generated and the operating system has to handle that. This is a very rudimentary or a very basic way to handle protection. Now let's look at the concept of address binding. What is address binding? So when you write a program, you have variables and functions, and those variables and functions need to have addresses. Otherwise, how would the CPU tell, go get me the data for this variable or store this data into that variable, call this function? So addresses are very important for variables and functions and other things in a program. Now the program goes through various stages. It is first compiled, and then it is linked, then it is loaded into memory, and then it is executed. These different stages bind different kinds of addresses to those variables and functions. So at compile time, usually relocatable addresses are bound to variables and functions. Now, what is the meaning of relocatable? That means that it is not guaranteed where the program is going to end up in memory, where the program is going to begin, what is going to be the beginning address of the program. Since the compiler has no idea what that is going to be, it is going to give relative addresses. It would say this variable is, for example, 14 bytes from the beginning of this module, and at runtime, whatever the beginning of the module is going to be, this variable will get an address of 14 bytes after the beginning of that module. So it is clearly relocatable. You can relocate the program and all the variables and functions will get the correct addresses because the differences are given by the compiler. When you link or you load a program, then absolute addresses are given because the loader knows where it is going to load the program, what is going to be the beginning of the module. So it can take these differences that the compiler has given, that okay, 14 bytes from the beginning, and now the loader knows what the beginning is. So it can give absolute addresses to those variables and functions. This slide talks about much of the same things that I was talking about in the slide before. At compile time, if you already know where your program is going to land in memory, then you can generate absolute code. But that is seldom the case. So the compiler must generate relocatable code if the memory location of the final program is not known at compile time. At load time, you can generate absolute addresses, but only if you know where the program is going to land again. Just like the compiler usually does not know where the program is going to land, it must generate relocatable code. If the loader also does not know what is going to happen at runtime, because the loader might put the program at one location, but the operating system might try to move it around to different segments at runtime, then the final address binding job is given to execution time instead of loading time. But usually the loader knows where the final program is going to be, so the loader can generate absolute addresses. But if that is not the case, then at execution time, the final addresses are generated, and those are the addresses that the CPU generates and sends to the memory unit for reads and writes. Again, you can see the process very quickly. You have the source program. You use your compilers and assemblers at compile time to create object modules. Then a bunch of object modules, as in your program can be a set of source files, assembly source listings, and whatnot. All of them will become single object modules, and all of them can be linked to create an executable. And that executable is loaded into memory at load time. And the loader, when it does that, it also takes the help of system libraries, because system libraries are usually not linked into the executable. So it is the job of the loader to also link in some functions and routines from the system library, and the execution of the program begins. But there are certain functions and modules which are used so commonly and they're used by so many programs that it does not make sense to put one copy each into each of your executables. So when your executable is running in memory, and if it encounters one such function, which is a common function, and the code for such functions is usually kept in DLLs, dynamic loaded system libraries, then your operating system can go fetch the code of that function from the DLL, put it in memory, and then also patch that memory. Tell your executable that, okay, you do not have the code for that function, but I have already retrieved that code from a DLL and put it in memory. Now you can go ahead and call that function because its address is this. This is where I have put it. Now there are two kinds of addresses: logical addresses and physical addresses. The addresses that are generated by your CPU, they are called logical or virtual addresses. The address that the memory unit sees, they are called physical addresses. There is a module in between. There is some functionality, there is some hardware that sits between the CPU and the memory unit that converts logical or virtual addresses to physical addresses. Now, when you are doing compilation or loading or linking, the program is not running yet. And for those purposes, logical and physical addresses mean the same thing. But when the program is running, the CPU is generating virtual or logical addresses, but those may not be the same addresses that the memory unit is seeing when the program is running at runtime or execution time. The memory management unit that is sitting in between the CPU and the memory unit might be, because it does not always happen, might be converting these logical addresses to physical addresses. And for the cases of running programs, there might be a difference between logical and physical addresses. At the time of compilation or linking or loading, physical addresses and virtual or logical addresses mean the same thing. So I was talking about the memory management unit before, and it is the unit that converts virtual addresses to physical addresses. Virtual as in logical addresses that the CPU generates, and physical address as in the addresses that the memory unit sees. Back in the day, when people used to use MS-DOS on Intel x86 processors, MS-DOS used to make use of 4 relocation registers. Now, these relocation registers used to contain the base address of the code, the data, the stack, and an extra segment. Right? So the code used to be in the code segment, the data for the program used to be in the data segment, the stack used to be in the stack segment, and there used to be an extra segment for holding other things. And what would happen is that, and let's look at that in the other slide, is that each of these relocation registers would have a base address. And the CPU would generate a logical address, the base address would get added to the logical address, and a physical address would get created, and that was the job of the MMU. So the memory management unit kind of knew that, okay, the CPU is generating a code address. I know the base address of my code segment relocation register. I'm going to take the logical address generated by the CPU. I'm going to add this number, and whatever number comes out here is the physical address, and this is what I'm going to send to the memory unit for reading or writing. So the OS had very little to do with setting up the values in these registers. It was usually the programs which would do it themselves, and that is what kept these things very, very simple. But there was a problem. If the programs would not choose these values carefully, then they might be overriding memory areas of other processes. So MS-DOS provides very little memory protection. So we talked about dynamic libraries a little bit ago. This slide talks about much of the same thing. If all the code that your program will ever need is put into one executable, then that is called static linking. At runtime, your operating system does not have to handle any missing code, because every function that you need in your program to get a successful result is right there in the executable that you compiled and linked. But that will usually result in big executables, because there are some functionalities like functions and modules which are so commonly used that it is better to keep them in one DLL, a dynamic linked library, and then at runtime, it is better to just get the code right there dynamically. So you're running a program which has got some functions whose code is not there in the program. So your compilers and linkers will leave a stub and say, okay, here is the function, but I don't have the code for this. Hey OS, whenever there is a need to call this function, you need to look at a DLL, a dynamic link library, bring in the code, give the program the address, and at runtime, the program will dynamically jump to that function, do its job, and come back. And this concept is called dynamic linking, because the linking of functions to your executable happens dynamically at runtime. It is not done statically at compilation or linking time. Now let us take a look at the concept of swapping. Now, as you probably already know, when you were little and you had smaller computers, and we used to usually talk about things like, my computer is running out of memory because I don't have so much RAM. My computer is running slow because I just have 8 MB of RAM. If you have 32 MB of RAM, then maybe you can run this game. Now, why that used to happen is usually the RAM that we have is not enough to hold the memory images, the working copy of all the processes that are running in the system. Now, if you run out of memory, what the operating system can do is take a few low priority processes and swap them out to your hard disk or some other speedier media. Speedier as in it cannot be a floppy drive, for example. A floppy drive is very, very slow. Speedier in comparison to a very slow thing like a floppy drive. Maybe your hard drive or your flash memory, your SSDs and things like that. It can have a backing store in those kinds of media. It can take the memory contents of a process and it can store it in the backing store. And it can also maintain a ready queue of all the processes in the backing store. And whenever there is a need for the process that is not in memory, but it is ready to run, but its contents are in the backing store, it can swap that process into memory. It can bring the contents from the backing store and put it in main memory, and then it can start running the process. A process that is not in main memory will not be able to run. But if you're running out of main memory, you can temporarily swap out some processes, their memory contents, and put it in a backing store, and you can maintain a ready queue. If that process is ready to run and the scheduler wants to schedule that, then you can bring that process from the backing store, that is your hard drive or your what we used to call the speedier memory, and they'll bring it back from the backing store and put it into your main memory, and then the process can start running. There are some challenges associated with swapping. Does the swapped out process need to swap back into the same physical address? Let's just say there is a process that was running at address number 500 and then it had 1 MB of memory from that address. From 500, it used to use 1 MB of memory. Now you swapped it out and you swapped in another process at 500. Now the process that was swapped out, if you want to run that, you cannot just swap it in and put it at memory address 500 again, because there is another process that is running at the same physical memory. So that is one challenge of swapping. Now, you can only swap out a process if you are sure that the process is idle with respect to input output. For example, if the process had a buffer inside its memory range and it was trying to read something from the hard drive. Now, before that thing could have been taken care of, the operating system swaps it out and puts a new process in the same memory location. Now, what might happen is that the contents of the hard drive can get written into the wrong memory area. I mean, the memory area is the same, but the process has been swapped out and another process is running there. So that can be a problem. A solution to that is to always use the kernel, that is the operating system, as an intermediary and say, okay, you create a buffer inside you, whatever the hard drive reads, you put it inside your buffer and give it to me whenever I need it. But this can lead to a problem called double buffering, which is totally unnecessary, and that can be one problem of swapping. Swapping is normally disabled, but if the memory availability is running really, really low, then swapping can be enabled in systems. This is just a schematic view of swapping. So as you can see, there was a process running here, it gets swapped out and it is stored in the backing store. Another process P2 gets scheduled and that runs for some time, and maybe at one point of time P2 can get swapped out and P1 can come back, and the backing store is one of those speedier auxiliary memory devices that we have, hard drives or SSDs or flash memory and things like that, and main memory is your RAM. Now let's discuss the consequence of swapping with respect to context switching time. So what is a context switch? When the CPU is running one process and then it has to go run another process because, well, the CPU's time needs to be shared by different processes, then it needs to context switch. It needs to remove one process from its execution and it needs to put it back in memory somewhere safe so that it can resume its execution at one point of time, and then it brings in another process and starts executing that process. Now, if the process that it wants to execute is not in memory, but it is stored in the backing store, then what happens? So that process has been swapped out in the backing store. It has to be brought back into the main memory, and only then its execution can start. Now, let's see. If the hard disk transfer rate is 50 MB per second, and if the process size is 100 MB, then swapping one process out can take this much time. And swapping another process of a similar size in can take another 2000 milliseconds. Here we are assuming that before one process can be swapped in for execution, another process has to be swapped out, because we're assuming, because swapping is going on, memory should be almost full. So for one process to come in for execution from the backing store, another process has to be swapped out. So this combined process of swapping out one process and then swapping in another process can be 2 into 2000 milliseconds, that is about 4 seconds. And that is an enormous amount of time compared to normal context switching, in which it's just a matter of microseconds maybe to swap one process for another. This swapping time can reduce if the amount of memory that is used by processes is less, and also it is very well known to the operating system. So if processes can make use of system calls like request memory and release memory, so the operating system can do a very good job at bookkeeping of how much memory a process is using, and that can make this process of swapping out and swapping in a little bit more efficient. We have already talked about the contents of this slide. I was talking about pending input output buffers that are there in a process, that might be there in a process. So if a process was going through some input output, and then it also had some buffers for filling in the input output data, and if the process was swapped out before it could even get the data, then what can happen is that a wrong process might get that data, or the data could override some essential memory contents of another process. The process that has taken the place of the old process which got swapped out. Now, processors might want to use the kernel space for buffering of their input output data, but that can result in double buffering, because the kernel will buffer it once and then it will transfer it to the buffer of the process, and that is not very efficient. Because swapping is a very time consuming process so far as context switching and input output and these things are concerned. So swapping is kind of disabled in modern operating systems, and swapping is only enabled if the memory is running really low. Memory availability is running really low. But modified versions of swapping do exist, in which you don't swap out entire processes, you choose to only swap out parts of the process. And we can see how this is done in the context of paging, in which we can swap out parts of a process and then bring them back as and when the process needs those so-called pages. In mobile operating systems, swapping is not allowed. Android and iOS, both of them, don't do it. What they do is something very novel. When memory is running low, they ask the apps, we call it applications as apps, as you all know. The operating system asks the apps to terminate execution, but also save their important state information somewhere, the state bundle somewhere. So if there is a calculator app, then the calculator app might want to store its entire stack of what all operations the user had already done and what was the current answer on the screen, and all of those information that can be saved into a bundle and thrown into the hard drive or the SD card or some persistent storage like that. And if the operating system wants to bring the calculator app back to life, then it can draw the UI, because it can always draw the UI because that information is right there in the executable. But the state in which the calculator app was there can be restored from the bundle, and to the user it will look as if nothing has happened. But in the meantime, when the operating system was running low on memory, it terminated the calculator application after saving its important state information, and then used the freed up memory to run something else. And after some time, when the user wanted to go back to the calculator application, it looked as if nothing of that sort had happened. And both iOS and Android do something similar like that. Both the OSs, Android and iOS, support paging though, And because of that, parts of applications can be swapped out. Some pages of an application, not the entire application, as in the traditional swap out does not happen. Parts of applications can be swapped out and swap in, and we will see that further in this chapter and in the next chapter as we go. But this traditional swapping out and swapping in of throwing out entire processes to a backing store and bringing them back when required even does not happen in Android and iOS. Let's discuss a mechanism through which memory was allocated to processes and the operating system in older operating systems. Usually, the lower memory addresses used to be given to the operating system, and the higher memory addresses used to be given to processes, and each process used to be contained in a single contiguous section of memory, as in there would be no interruptions in the range of memory that is allocated to a process. If the process begins at one place, then it will just continue contiguously till it ends, and then maybe another process can begin from where the first process's memory addresses stop. And the operating system is given the lower set of addresses, and the upper set of addresses go to processes. And the memory for the operating system and the processes are allocated contiguously. And we have also studied this before. And protection can be achieved if memory is allocated contiguously using relocation registers, and it is a job of the MMU to map logical addresses dynamically, as you can see right here. So there is a CPU and that generates logical addresses. So there is a limit register which says, okay, are you within the limit? If not, we will trap. If yes, then I'm going to add the contents of a relocation register to you, and then a physical address is created. So this is the job of the MMU right here, that takes a logical address and converts that to a physical address. It does a check, then it adds a base to give you a physical memory. And this is how processes used to run in older operating systems. So for the process, it does not really matter where it is running, as long as its logical addresses follow a continuous pattern. So there are no gaps in the logical addresses that it generates, right? And the operating system can also guarantee that those logical addresses are also contiguous over here, because the MMU cannot introduce any jumps. All it is doing is checking for a limit to make sure that this process is not trying to access addresses outside the range that it is supposed to access within, and that wherever it is placed by the operating system, its base is stored in a relocation register by the operating system, so that one time when it is running, the relocation register might be somewhere over here, so the process might be present somewhere here. The second time, if it is running, then the operating system might allocate the process somewhere over here, and so the relocation register might be somewhere over here. So for the process, it does not matter where it is placed. For the OS, it matters that the CPU, whatever addresses the CPU is generating, is within the range. And it also matters to the operating system that wherever it has placed the process, the physical addresses are actually getting generated in that region, because the relocation register has been set to the base of that region. In the context of contiguous allocation, there is something called a multiple partition allocation, in which each process can be of varying sizes. Here, as you can see, process 5 is small, process 8 is really, really big, process 2 is again small, and the entire memory is not partitioned into any fixed size partitions. So the partitions can be of varying sizes. And so just imagine this situation over here. So the operating system is always there, and after the OS has been given its area, here you can see the rest of the processes that are present in the system at this point of time. Now process 2 has definitely come before processes 5 and 8, but when process 2 arrived, then this was probably the best place to keep it, and when process 5 arrived, then this was the best place to keep that, and process 8 was able to just fit into the gap between 5 and 2. They arrived in different orders, but at this point of time, this is the state in which the processes are arranged. So if process 8 exits, then a hole is created. So that is called a free partition or a hole. Whereas process 5 and process 2 are called allocated partitions because they still exist. Now, when process 8 exits, then there is this huge hole that gets created. Now, when process 9 comes in, then the operating system will use some algorithms to figure out an appropriate hole for the process. Now, that can be the first fit, best fit, or the worst fit, as we will see in the next slide. But depending on whatever fit it wants to go for, it will figure out a hole and then it will allocate some area of that hole to this process so that the process can sit there and start executing. Now, if another process, process 10 comes in, then process 10 can go in this hole right here because this hole is big enough to fit process 10, and still there is another small hole over here which the OS might use later. So there are three ways in which the operating system finds a hole large enough for a process to fit. It can do first fit, so it goes through the list of all the holes, and the first hole that is large enough to hold a process is chosen. Then there is a best fit. It will allocate the smallest hole that is just big enough to store the process. So it is not going to go for a huge hole and then take a small chunk of it. It will go through all the holes in the system and figure out which hole is just big enough for this process to fit in. And this produces the smallest leftover hole. Leftover hole as in when process 8 exited over here and process 9 came here. So this is the leftover hole. But process 9 was really small. It did not need such a big hole. So if the operating system could have gone below process 2 in the entire memory area and found a hole which was just a little bit bigger than process 9, then the leftover hole would not have been this big as we see over here. Then there is a worst fit. I don't know why would anyone want to do that, but in this strategy, you allocate the largest hole and you must also search the entire list and figure out the largest hole and then give that largest hole to this process. And this produces the largest leftover hole. So first fit and best fit work better than worst fit in terms of speed and storage utilization. Two kinds of fragmentations can happen if memory is allocated the way we were talking about. External fragmentation can happen when the total memory space exists to satisfy a request, but it is not contiguous. So as you saw here, so holes get created. Now there is a hole here. Now, if all the processes that arrive after this, they cannot fit into this hole, but there is also another small hole over here, and let me draw it for you. So assume that there is another small hole over here, right? But a process comes in which is little bit bigger than this. So it is of this size. Now this process cannot fit into this hole. It cannot fit into this hole, but it could have easily fit into the combination of the size of this hole and this hole. But since we really want to do contiguous memory allocation, these two holes are of no use for holding this process. So these two holes that are kind of far away because process 2 is sitting in the middle, these are the result of external fragmentation. Internal fragmentation can also happen. Now, when we were talking about contiguous allocation, we decided that we will not be using any fixed size partitions. All the processes could have varying amounts of memory sizes, and we will figure out a hole and put them over there using the best fit, first fit, or the worst fit strategy. But imagine if our memory had fixed size partitions. So let me draw some kind of memory over here, and I will draw fixed size partitions. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have 4 partitions, each of similar size, or almost similar size. Pardon my drawing, but just assume that all of these partitions are of the same size. If a process comes that takes this partition, and only little bit of this partition. So this area cannot go to another process, because the rule here is that one partition can only go to one process. So whatever it uses here is used by that process, but the rest of the partition number 3 is not used by that process. So that is called internal fragmentation. So if you have fixed size partitions and you allocate certain partitions to a process contiguously, what can happen is that if the size of the process is not exactly divisible by the size of the partitions, it can not cover the last partition completely, and whatever size is left over in that last partition goes towards internal fragmentation. Now there is a 50% rule which says that if you use first fit for allocating your memory, and given that there are n blocks, then 50% of those n blocks, that is 0.5 n number of blocks, will be lost due to fragmentation. That is, 1/3 of the blocks may be unusable, and this is also called as the 50% rule. One of the ways to handle fragmentation is compaction. So what you can do is, if there are holes all over the place, what you can do is move the processes around so that the holes can coalesce to make a bigger hole. So for example, let me draw it again. So this is the memory area, and here let's just say there is process number 1. Here there is a hole. Here there is process number 2, and here there is another hole. So what if we move process number 2 over here, and then it looks like this. We have process number 1 and we have process number 2, and these two holes can combine to become a bigger hole. Now there is no fragmentation, because now this is a contiguous chunk of memory that can be assigned to any process that is equal to or just smaller than this hole. Now the problem with that kind of compaction is, if the execution cannot handle the addresses that are generated by process number 2. So process number 2 has been coded to run at this memory location. Now if it moves here, the operating system execution needs to be able to rebind the addresses of 2 so that it can run properly at its new location. So if relocation is dynamic, if the operating system can dynamically rebind the addresses of 2 so that it can run at a new location all the time while it is active and lively, then compaction is possible. And there is also an IO problem which we have talked about before. If some IO was going on in process number 2, and if you just move this process to a new location, then that IO might get affected. Now you can choose to use kernel buffers, but double buffering is a problem. There are other issues. And if your backing store is an exact replica of how your main memory is, so that swapping in and swapping out is just a mirror image of each other, then the fragmentation problems that plague the main memory will also be an issue for the backing store. That is something we should keep in mind. Now let's go on to learn about the mechanism segmentation that we have been talking about so much till now. Now when you write a program as a developer, you look at your program as a main program, a certain set of procedures, functions, methods, objects, variables, the stack, the heap, and lots of other things. Now this is how your program looks to you. There is a subroutine here, there is a stack, there is a square root function over here, the main program is right here, there is a symbol table, and these are all bound by the logical addresses that your program will generate. The CPU will generate addresses, and those are logical addresses. So what if we could take the main program and put it into one segment? We could take the square root function and we could put it into another segment. We could take the heap and put it into another segment, and we could take, let's just say, all the constants in the program and put it into another segment. Now, this is the user space. This is your logical space. In this space, you can have your logical addresses any way you want them to be. But when the MMU comes into the picture and that MMU does segmentation, then it can take the first segment and put it here in physical memory, and then it might choose to put the segment number 4 over here, then segment number 2, and then segment number 3. So it can scramble the segments and put it wherever it wants to, wherever it is the most convenient to put it. It is not guaranteed that the segments are allocated in sequence in physical memory. Whereas over here, you could assume that these are in some kind of a sequence and the logical addresses are in increasing order or whatever you want. But over here, there is no guarantee that the segments are in order. As you can see, the first segment went here, the fourth segment comes right after that. So segmentation can make this kind of an arrangement possible, as we will see further. So for segmentation to work, we'll have to look at the architecture of segmentation. So logical addresses can be split into two parts. The part on the left side, as in the most significant parts of the address, those can go for the segment number. And the parts on the right side, those are the least significant parts of the address. Those can be the offset into the segment. So the segment can look something like this, right? So this is a segment, and the segment can have a base address. So the segment number part of the address will be used to figure out which segment this logical address belongs to, and then we will use this segment number to look into a segment table which will give us this base address. So this base address is this address. Now this offset is how many bytes inside the segment that memory address resides. So if this is the memory address that we are trying to work with over here, then this distance from the base is the offset. So offset is this distance over here, and the segment number can be used to look into a segment table which the operating system maintains, and from that segment table we can find the base for this segment number. So we get the base over here, and from the logical address, the right parts, the least significant parts of the address, given there is a proper division between how many bits go for the segment number and how many bits go for the offset, we can figure out how much into the segment that memory address is. And that is how we can convert a logical address to a physical address. So as already mentioned, so the segment number can be used to look into a segment table. Now the operating system maintains a segment table somewhere, and the operating system knows where the segment table is because that is stored in the segment table base register. So the segment table base register will give you the location of the segment table. You will use the segment number to look into this table to figure out this segment's base and its limit. You need to know the limit of this segment, the maximum size of this segment. Then once you have figured out the base, you can then take this offset and then look into the segment to find out where in physical memory your logical address is there. So this is how we can take a logical address and convert it into a physical address. There is also a segment table length register, STLR, which is basically used for protection purposes again. Now, I might say process number 2 can only use 3 segments, segment number 0, 1, and 2. So if it generates a logical address, which is an address in segment number 5, then STLR might say no. The maximum number of segments that you are allowed is 3. So you cannot go to segment number 5 because that is outside your reach, and that can be used to generate traps, and it is for extra protection. Now, protection is not only guaranteed by the segment table length register as we saw here. We also have validation bits in segments. If the validation bit for a segment is set to 0 in the segment table, so in the segment table you will have one entry for each segment, and those entries can have different bits on them. One of the bits is the validation bit, which if it is 0, it is an illegal segment, and this process cannot access that segment. If it is trying to access that segment, you will get a trap. Now, the segments can also have read, write, and execute privileges. If the program is trying to read from a segment in which the read bit is set, then it is allowed. But if the write bit is not set, and if it is trying to write data into that segment, then a trap will be generated. If it is trying to execute code that is stored in that segment, and the execute bit on that segment is not set, then a trap will also be raised. So we will go to the next slide to figure out how segmentation works in the segmentation hardware. And I've already talked about most of these things. So the CPU generates logical addresses. So the left parts, the most significant parts, will be used to look into a segment table. So the segment table is like this, and since the segment number is S, so we start at the beginning, we go S number of entries into the segment table because it is segment number S. So this gap is S, and we figure out the limit and the base for that segment. And once we know the limit and base, we take the offset from the logical address. Now, the least significant bits on the right side of the logical address, they form the offset. Now, if the offset is more than or equal to the limit, then a trap will be generated because you are trying to go outside the segment that way. So the offset has to be strictly less than the limit. And if it is so, then the base of the segment is taken and this offset is added to that, and you can get your physical memory address that way. So this is the process that we use to convert a logical or a virtual address to a physical address when segmentation is being used. We looked at segmentation. Now let's look at the other famous mechanism in which memory can be ordered and managed. It's called paging. It is very similar to segmentation. In segmentation, we could go for non-contiguous physical memory allocation for processes, but each of those segments could be of varying length. So you could still have external fragmentation and all the problems that come with varying sized memory chunks, they all were there in segmentation. But what if we could divide physical memory into fixed sized blocks called frames and also divide the logical memory range into blocks of the same size called pages, and then have a page table in the memory management unit that will map a page in the logical space to frames in the physical space. Then we could have allocations where a certain process will not have a contiguous or in order allocation in the physical space, but its logical addresses can be contiguous and they can be whatever they want. But there is a page table conversion that can happen in the memory management unit that will take a page number and it will figure out the frame number, and then it can generate physical addresses from logical addresses. Now let's look at how that works in the next slide. But before moving on, you have to still keep in mind that internal fragmentation can still happen in paging. Now, what is internal fragmentation? We remember that if memory is divided into fixed size partitions, then it is not always necessary that the amount of memory you need for a process will be an exact multiple of the block size. So if the process takes, for example, in paging, 3 pages, and there is a little bit of leftover, then it will need 4 complete pages. Even if the 4th page is not completely full, it will still be allocated to that process, and we still have internal fragmentation. It is also important to keep in mind that the frame size is always equal to the page size. That is the fixed sized blocks into which we divide the physical memory, and each of those blocks is called a frame. Then we also divide the logical memory space into pages, and the size of each page is equal to the size of each frame. Just like in segmentation, in paging also, a logical address can be divided into 2 parts. The most significant bits, that is P denoted over here, that can be the page number, and the least significant bits can be the page offset. We have n number of bits to signify the page offset and m minus n number of bits to signify the page number. The total number of bits is obviously m, and m bits are enough to specify all addresses in the logical address space. So we have 2 to the power m as the size of the logical address space, and since n bits are enough to specify all page offsets, then the size of a single page would be 2 to the power n. So once we decide on a page number, then we try to find where inside the page the memory location is, and then if we have n bits to specify the page offset, then obviously the size of a page is 2 to the power n, and we have m minus n bits for the page number. So if we have a table where there are page table entries which specify information about a page, then how many entries will that page table have? It will have 2 to the power m minus n at the top, because m minus n bits are used to signify page numbers. So how many page numbers can be there? There can be 2 to the power m minus n page numbers, and if there is a table which has information about those pages, as in where the page begins, whether the page is valid, whether we can read, write, execute, different things that we saw for segmentation, different things that were there in the segment table entries. Similar things can be there in page table entries, and page table entries go into page tables. And if m minus n bits are used to signify page numbers, there can be 2 to the power m minus n entries in a page table. So here you can look at the entire process very, very clearly. So the CPU generates a logical address, and the logical address is split into two parts. This is the page offset and this is the page number. The page number is used to look at page information inside a page table. Since we are looking at the P number page entry, so we get into P entries into the page table. So this distance is P. So once we have found the Pth page table entry, we figure out the frame number, as in which frame of physical memory is this page mapped to. As we know, we can have pages in logical address space and we can have frames in the physical address space, and it is the job of the page table to map a page to a frame. So we find the page number from the logical address, we look into a page table, we look at the correct page table entry, and that is given by P, the page table number, and from the entry we figure out the frame number to which this particular page has been mapped by the operating system. Then we replace P by F, and this is the frame number, and the offset just remains the same because the size of a page is equal to the size of a frame. So whatever distance or whatever offset into a page this logical address is, in physical address space it would be the same offset inside a frame. So we just replace P with F, and the information about F is given by the page table inside a page table entry. So we look at the page number, we go to the correct page table entry, we figure out the frame number, and we replace P by F, and the offset remains the same. Now this logical address has been converted into a physical address. Now we can go read and write in our physical memory. Here is an example. So our logical memory has been divided into 4 pages: page 0, page 1, page 2, and page 3. And here is a page table. So we have page table entries for page 0, page 1, page 2, page 3, and these are the frame numbers that are mapped in the page table. So for page number 0, we look at entry number 0 and the frame number is 1. So we go to frame number 1 and we see in physical memory page number 0 is present right here. For page number 1, the frame number is 4. So we go to frame number 4 and we see page number 1 is mapped right there. Similarly, for page number 2, the mapping is at frame number 3 and page number 2 is right there. For page number 3, the mapping is at frame number 7 and page number 3 is right there in frame number 7 in physical memory. This is another more involved example of a page table. Here we have n equal to 2. Now what does that mean? That means that the page size is 2 to the power 2, which is 4. So as you can see, each page has 4 bytes in it, and m equal to 4. What does that mean? That means that the logical memory space, its size is 2 to the power 4, which is 16. And as you can see, it has 16 entries over here. So how many pages are there? So we have to do m minus n, which is 2, and 2 to the power 2 is basically 2 to the power m minus n is 4, and we have 4 pages. And as you can see, the page table has 4 entries for 4 pages right here. And let's look at the mapping. So this is page number 0, and page number 0 has a frame number of 5. So let's go to frame number 5. This is frame number 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And as you can see, page 0 had ABCD, and frame number 5 also has ABCD. And how can you easily know that this is frame number 20? Well, what you do is you basically get the frame number and multiply it with the size of a page. Since the size of a page is also equal to the size of a frame, and that is 4, you multiply 5 with 4 and you get 20, which is the physical memory address of the base of that frame. Let's just do one more. Page number 3's frame number is 2. We multiply 2 with 4 and we get 8. And as you can see, the contents of page number 3, which is MNOP, is present right here in frame number 2, which begins at address 8, because 8 is equal to 2 into 4. MNOP is right there. I said that internal fragmentation is still possible in paging. And let's see how that is possible. So the page size is 2048 bytes and the process size is 72766 bytes. So this is exactly equal to 35 pages, 35 into 2048 plus these 1086 bytes extra. So how many pages do you need? You need 36 pages. Even if the last page is not going to be completely occupied, you still need it. And what is the internal fragmentation? The last page had space for 2048 bytes. You are only using 1086 bytes. So we have a wastage of 962 bytes. The worst case fragmentation can be, just imagine if this process had 35 pages and just 1 byte left over here. For that 1 byte, we would have to take an entire frame of memory, an entire page of memory. That would be the worst case. On an average, usually half a frame worth of page is usually lost due to internal fragmentation. So should we just make small frame sizes? Because if the frame size or the page size, because page sizes are equal to frame sizes, here if we had made the page size to, let's just say, 512 bytes, then the fragmentation would have been very, very less, because out of this 1086 bytes, even 2 pages, 1024 bytes could have gone to 2 complete pages, and only a few bytes would have been left. And agreed that would have taken another 512 bytes of a page, but the loss would not have been as high as 962. But the problems with very small frame sizes is that we need a lot of page table entries. So if you make the page size very, very small, so as you remember, we had n bits for the page offset and m minus n bits for the page number. So if you make the pages very, very small, then the offset is very, very small. So you don't need those n bits for the offset. So if n is small, and let me draw it for you right here. So your logical address is kind of like this, and you have n bits for offset and m minus n bits for the page number, right? Now, if you have small pages, then this is small, right? So your logical address is still the same size, but your frames are small. So you don't need such a large offset. And this is again m minus n. So what happens? Your m minus n is bigger. So now you have more page numbers. And when you have more page numbers, you need more page table entries in a page table, and the page tables can become very, very big. In fact, modern operating systems and modern hardware prefer to use bigger pages because fragmentation is there, but these days RAM is very, very cheap. So to avoid the maintenance cost of so many page table entries, operating systems are usually okay with loss of memory due to internal fragmentation, but they try to get as much as possible out of the efficiency gains in having less number of page table entries. Now let's look at the concept of free frames. So the operating system has to maintain a list of free frames in physical memory. It is only then that it would be able to allocate those frames to pages for a new process and then map them in a page table. So before allocation, the operating system had all these frames free, and a new process comes in which needs 4 frames. Now, before allocation, physical memory used to look like this. After allocation, the process is there in memory right now, and we have a new process page table. Page number 0 has gone to frame number 14 in physical memory. Page number 1 has gone to frame number 13. Page number 2 has gone to frame number 18, and page number 3 has gone to frame number 20. As you can see, those allocations have been done here. They are not contiguous, they are not in order, and that is basically what paging is and what paging lets you do. And now the free frame list is shorter because 4 frames are gone and only 1 frame, that is frame number 15, is free at this point of time. Just like in segmentation, like the segment table used to be kept in memory somewhere, page tables are also kept in main memory, and the location of the page table is usually given by something called a page table base register. And there is also something called a page table length register, which can be used for extra protection. So if the logical address says that I need a very high page number which is not allocated to the process, then the operating system can raise a trap. We saw similar concepts in segmentation also. So every memory access by the process will need to go through 2 accesses. One is the access into the page table so that it knows which frame to go to in physical memory, and then once it knows the physical address, then the actual access into RAM or physical memory has to happen. Then it has to come back to the process. Now, how do we avoid 2 accesses? Well, just like in CPUs, we used caches, right? So we used to first go to the cache to see if something is present. If it is not present, only then we would go to main memory. Just like that, we could use something called associative memory or translation look-aside buffers. They are called TLBs, and this is a very important concept in operating systems. So what the system can do is first go and look inside translation look-aside buffers to see if a certain page table mapping is present in those TLBs. If it is present, then it will find the frame number from that TLB and directly go to physical memory and get its data or store the data. If it is not present in the TLB, then the page table and memory will be consulted, and then it will go on from there. So in the next slide, we will see using a diagram how this works. So this is an example of a TLB, a translation look-aside buffer. So when a CPU generates a logical address, the address is split into 2 parts. As we know, there is a page number and there is an offset. Now the page number is first sent into a TLB, and these comparisons happen parallelly. We don't go one by one. We don't go linearly because that would be very, very wasteful and it might take a lot of time. Memory accesses have to be done extremely fast. You cannot afford to take so long to do a single memory access. That is why these kinds of memories are called associative memories, as in the access into the different cells of these memories can be done simultaneously, that is parallelly. So all the entries here are searched to see if this page number P is present. If it is present, then it is called a TLB hit. We immediately get the frame number. Now we know F, so we have removed P and we put F into the logical address. The offset remains the same and we go to physical memory. If there is a TLB miss, if this page number is not present in this TLB, then as usual, we'll look into the page table, which is again in main memory somewhere. We figure out the frame number. This is slower, but we still have to do it because it was not present in the TLB. Now we figure out the frame number and we go to the physical address space to get the data or store the data. And we also try to put the value of F into the TLB because it is very likely that the next access is also going to happen inside the same page. So if there is one TLB miss, next time around that same TLB miss should not happen. Sometimes TLBs also store address space identifiers called assets in each TLB entry. So just imagine something like this. So over here we can store some assets also. So why is that necessary? Just imagine one process is running and that process has its own mapping from pages to frames. Now, if that process stops running and another process starts running, whatever stale entries, the old entries in TLB that are there, those will not work correctly for the new process. So, for example, both processes can have their page number zeros mapped to different frames, right, in physical memory. Now, over here, if we have page number 0 is mapped to frame number 15 for process 1. Now, if a context switch happens and process 2 comes in, so that process's page number 0 might be mapped to frame number 20 in physical memory. But the TLB entry over here has the entry for the first process, process 1, which says page number 0 is mapped to frame number 15. So if you look at the TLB for the second process using the entries of the first process, you will go to the incorrect physical address frames. That is why if you do not store address space identifiers over here, which are basically described here, then what will happen is that for every context switch, you'd have to flush the TLB. If a new process comes in, this entire TLB has to be flushed, and as and when TLB misses happen, the TLB will start getting populated. But if you also store some process specific information in the TLB, which says, okay, process number 1, page number 0, now goes to frame number 15, but process number 2, page number 0 goes to frame number 20, then you don't have to flush the TLB for every context switch. Now let's look at the concept of effective access time. We know that TLB misses can happen. It is not always that when you try to look for a page table entry inside a TLB that you always find it. So misses do happen. And if a miss happens, then you have to go to main memory. You have to go into the real page table and figure out the entry and then go on from there. So we define something called a hit ratio, which is the percentage of times that a page number is found in the TLB. And we take a couple of examples to figure out the effective access time. So if the hit ratio is 0.8, which is 80%, and memory access time is 100 nanoseconds. So 80% of the time, you can figure out the page table mapping from a TLB. So you just have to do the real memory access, which is after you get the logical address converted to a physical address, you go to the main memory and get it. And 20% of the time, you have to do two memory accesses, that is 2 into 100 nanoseconds. One time to look at the page table, and the second one is the real access. So the effective access time is then 120 nanoseconds. A more realistic hit ratio would be 99%, because after a process starts running for a while, all the important page entries actually get populated into the TLB and the misses become really rare. And for 99%, the effective access time is 101 nanosecond, which is very close to that of a single access to memory. So the disadvantage or the extra time that gets introduced because of paging functionality is very, very low, which is just about 1%. Now let's look at how memory protection can be done in paging. Just like in segmentation, we had read, write, execute bits, valid, invalid bits. The same bits can be used in page table entries also. So the page table entries would not only contain the frame number, they can also contain things like the execute only bit, read only bit, read write, whether the page is valid or invalid. So all these bits can provide extra protection. So if there is a page table mapping to a process and the process is not supposed to write to that area, then you can just not have the right bit set, and then the process will not be able to write to that area. If you have doubts that the contents of a certain area of memory can contain malicious code and you don't want the process to be able to execute anything in that area, then you can set the execute bit of that memory area to false, and the process will never be able to execute anything that is located in that memory region. If the valid bit of a page table entry is set to invalid, that is, it is not set, then a process will never be able to access, read, write, execute anything from that page. You can use that, or you can use page table length registers, just like we had segment table length registers. You can also use PTLRs. And any violations that occur, violations like there is a read-only bit set, but you're trying to write, or if the execute bit is not set, you're trying to execute something in that page. Any of these violations, you try to access an invalid page, or you have gone beyond what is mentioned in the page table length register. You're trying to use a page number which is bigger than what is available in PTLR, then a violation can occur. And these are all traps into the kernel, and the kernel would know how to handle these. So here is an example of a page table which has page table entries that have the valid and the invalid bits set in these page table entries. Here you can see that page table entries 0 until 5 are valid, but page table entries 6 and 7 are invalid. So a process can only access memory areas from page number 0 to page number 5. It cannot go beyond that because those page table entries are marked as invalid. Processes can share pages. If there is read-only code, then it does not make sense to have that code in more than one physical frame. So there can be one frame which has that read-only code, and multiple processes that want to run that code can have their pages mapped to the same frame, and so we can call these pages as shared pages. Now, the shared page does not need to be read-only. It could be read and write, and two processes can have two different pages mapped to that same physical frame, and they can read and write to that page. They can adopt mutual exclusion and use that as their inter-process communication strategy. So one process can write to it, another process can then read it. They can probably use something like readers, writers, locks, or other things to effectively communicate between each other. Processes can also have private code and data, as they always do. And let's look at the next slide to see how that happens. You can see three processes over here, and the first three pages of each of these processes are shared. As you can see, the first three pages are mapped to frames 346, 346, and 346 over here. So they're all shared between the three processes. The last pages of each of these processes, that is data 1, data 2, and data 3, they are mapped to distinct pages. So the last page here is mapped to frame number 1, here it is frame number 7, and here it is frame number 2. So these are private pages of these processes, but ED1, ED2, and ED3, the first three pages of each of these processes are shared because they are all mapped to the same frames. That is, ED1 for all of them is mapped to frame number 3, ED2 for all of them is mapped to frame number 4, and ED3 for all of those processes is mapped to frame number 6. And here are the physical frames over here. As you can see, there is only one copy of ED1, one copy of ED2, and one copy of ED3, while there are three distinct copies of the private pages of these processes, that is data 1, data 3, and data 2 over here. Now let's consider this situation. Suppose our logical address space is 32 bits in size, and the page size is 4 KB. That is, the offset has 12 bits, and 2 to the power 12 is 4 KB. Then how many page table entries should be there? So we can divide the total size of our logical address space with the page size, and we will get this number. Now, if each of those entries takes 4 bytes, as in each entry would store the frame number, the different valid, read, write, execute bits, and a bunch of other things. And in real hardware and operating systems, the page table entries can actually be 4 bytes each. Then if you take this number and you multiply that by 4, you get 4 megabytes. So if we would have to have page table entries for the entire logical address space, then 4 megabytes of space would only be needed to store the page table. That is a lot of memory, and it is usually seen that processes don't even need that much memory. So even if they have 32 bits of logical address space, they don't go on to use all the space from 0 to 4 gigabyte. They use only a subset of space, and as they grow, more pages are given to them. So there is no point in allocating all the pages to them and only map some of them and have invalid bits set for the rest of the page table entries. So we don't need 4 megabytes of page table entries for most processes. So we can start with smaller number of page table entries and keep on growing when we need more. So the simple kind of paging that we saw will always need all the pages mapped at any one point of time. But we can look at 3 strategies, that is hierarchical paging, hashed page tables, and inverted page tables, in which we can get away with smaller number of page table entries, and we will see how that happens in 3 different mechanisms. So the idea with hierarchical page tables is that we just don't have one layer of page tables at the beginning. So we can have multiple levels of page tables and we can walk through them. So we can have the outer page table over here, then we can have some inner page tables, and we can have maybe another level of inner page tables, and then we can go to the frames. So it is not necessary that the outer page table maps the entire address space. It can choose to map only a subset of the entire logical space, and then whatever it chooses to map, only those inner page tables will be present. And so we don't have to have the entirety of the page table entries for the entire logical space. So this is one example of a 2-level page table scheme. So here you can look at an outer page table, and that points to inner page tables, and then they in turn have the real page table entries that would give you the frame numbers. Now let's explore a more concrete example of a 2-level paging scheme. So our machine is a 32-bit machine, that is the logical address space is 32 bits wide, and the page size is 1K, that is 1024 bytes. So if the page size is 1K, you obviously need 10 bits for the offset. So 32 minus 10 is 22, and that is what you need to signify the page number. So in the initial scheme that we saw, we would have all the 22 bits indexed into one page table. But now with 2-level paging, we can take those 22 bits and we can divide them into an outer page table that would take up 12 bits, and then an inner page table that would take the 10 bits. So once we go into the outer page table, we figure out some location into this page table. And then once we get into the inner page table, we get the real frame number, and then we use the page offset to get into a memory location into that page. So this page number basically got divided into 2 different parts. One is for the outer layer and one is for the inner layer. So you use P1 to index into the outer page table, you use P2 to index into the inner page table, and then you use the offset to index into the page. So that way, as we will see, we can have far lesser page table entries, because now the number of bits for the inner page table is only 10. So we would not have so many inner page tables. It is only the ones that the outer page table chooses to map. Only those are the ones that would have the inner page table entries. This is usually called a forward mapped page table, because we first go to the outer page table, then we go to the inner page table, and then we go to the page. And this is a more diagrammatic explanation of what I talked in the last slide. So we use P1 to index into an outer page table. So this is an outer page table, and you see the gap here from the base is P1, which is basically this number over here. And then whatever address we get, then that is the base address of the inner page table. And then we use P2 to index into that inner page table, and then we get the base address of the frame. And then we use D to index into that frame, and we get our physical memory location. So what happens if we have a 64-bit logical address space? Then you would see that if our page sizes are still 4 KB, so that would be 12 bits for the page offset, we are still left with 52 bits for the page numbers. And then if we do a split like this, of the outer page table getting 42 bits and the inner page table getting 10 bits, then 42 bits is again too high of a number for outer pages. That would be 2 to the power 44 bytes. That is a lot of bytes just for the outer page tables. So 2 levels of paging is not sufficient for 64-bit logical address spaces. We will need more levels for 64-bit logical addresses. So we go for a 3-level paging scheme. So if we had to do a 2-level paging scheme, we'd have to have 42 bits for the outer page. But what we usually do is that we split it into one more level. So we have a second outer page of 32 bits, we have an outer page of 10 bits, and we have an inner page of 10 bits. And then the offset is of 12 bits. So if I take the 32 bits of the logical address here and I index into the second outer page, I will find the base address of the outer page. Once I find the base address of the outer page, I will use these 10 bits to index into that page to find out the base address of the inner page. Once I find the base address of the inner page, I will use these 10 bits to index into that to find the base address of the frame. Then once I know the base address of the physical frame, then I will use the 12 bits over here to index into that frame and find my physical memory location. Let's quickly look at another variation of the mechanisms that can be used to not have so many page table entries. So apart from multi-level paging schemes, we can also use hashed page tables, and in the diagram it is pretty clear what it is doing. So our logical address space is again divided into a page number and an offset. We can take the page number and instead of directly indexing into a page table, and if we do that, we would really need lots of page table entries, and that is why we are not doing it. We would actually take the page number and use a hash function. And the hash function will give us a location in a hash table that has page table entries inside them. So look at this. So we take P and we put it into a hash function, we get some value, and then that helps us do a lookup inside a hash table that has a few page table entries chained like this. Now you might ask, why is this chaining there? Because whenever you use a hash function, there is a possibility of collisions. So more than one entries can map to the same hash function value. So there is a possibility that multiple page table entries could exist here. So what we can do is, after we look into this hash table and we find these values over here, we go one by one to see which one of them has P, because that is our page number. So this is Q. So we go to the next one in the linked list and we get P. And we know that the frame number here is R. So we patch P by R and the offset remains the same, and we go to the physical address. So in this hash table, we don't have to store information about all the page table entries. That is, we don't need information about all the possible page table entries that occupy 4 MB of space as we saw before. We can get away with only a small number of page table entries over here. And as you know, hash functions are really quick, but they cannot be O of 1 if there are a lot of collisions, by the way. So we have to choose our hash function in a way that avoids lots of collisions. Because for example, here we got lucky because only the second entry was the correct one. But what if this chain was really long? Then this operation will not be O of 1, and we need to traverse this linked list until we find the correct page number that we are looking for. Let's look at the third mechanism using which we can avoid having too many page table entries, and that is called inverted page table architecture. So this diagram again makes it very clear. When you generate logical addresses, we also take into account the process ID, and as always we have the page number and the offset, the page offset right here. So we take the combination of PID and the page number, and then we do a linear search inside a page table. Now it is not guaranteed that this page table is sorted according to the page number. It is not. It is actually sorted according to the frame number. So once we do a search, and at one point we will find the PID-P combination over here, and then we will see how far down the page table have we gone. And this distance from the base is actually the frame number. And then once we find the frame number, we can use the offset over here and we can go to physical memory. The reason why this is called inverted is because this table is not indexed by the logical page number. It is actually indexed by the physical frame number. That is why it is inverted. So you might ask, this linear searching can take a lot of time because you have to first look at the first entry and say, okay, does this entry even belong to this process? No. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, this entry belongs to this process, but is this the page number? No, the PID matched, but the page number did not match. So you keep going like that until you find your PID P combination somewhere, and then you find how far have you gone, and that is your frame number I. So we can use TLBs to accelerate this process because translation look-aside buffers use associative memory, and in associative memory you can do a parallel search. You can look at all the entries at the same time parallelly, simultaneously, and you don't have to do a linear search. Such kinds of searches are very, very cheap time-wise. Now let's quickly look at the Intel 32 and 64-bit architectures. We will also give a brief glimpse at the ARM architecture before concluding this chapter. As you all know, Intel chips have been the dominant industry chips for many decades now. Pentium CPUs are 32-bit and are called IA32 architecture. The current Intel CPUs are 64-bit and they are called the IA64 architecture. Many variations in the chips are there. We will just cover the main ideas over here. The Intel IA32, that is a 32-bit architecture, supports both segmentation and segmentation with paging. So you can either use only segmentation or you can choose to use segmentation with paging. Each segment can be 4 GB big. You can have up to 16K segments per process, and these 16K segments are divided into two parts. One partition is described by the local descriptor table, and these are private to the process, and you can have 8K segments like that. And then the second partition is described by the global descriptor table, that is GDT, and you can have 8K segments that way, and these 8K segments are shared among all the processes. The CPU generates logical addresses as always, and they are fed to the segmentation unit. So the segmentation unit gets an address like this. So there is a segment selector, which is basically the segment number that takes 13 bits. And then there is a G bit, which basically tells you whether it should go to the GDT, the global descriptor table, or the LDT, the local descriptor table. As we saw, there are 8K each in each of those tables. And then this P is used for protection. Then whatever comes out of the segmentation unit, whatever address we get, we call that the linear address. And then that address can go into the paging unit, and the linear address is converted to a physical address inside the paging unit. And the page sizes can be 4 KB or 4 MB in the Intel IA32 architecture. So this is how it goes. The CPU generates logical addresses, they go into the segmentation unit. So the segmentation unit will look at the base address of the segment number that you have chosen. Then it will add the offset to it to give you a linear address. And we have seen how this works in the segmentation slides before. The linear address is then given to the paging unit. It will look at the linear address in this format. So it will think of these 10 bits as the outer page table, these 10 bits as belonging to the inner page table, and 12 bits for the offset. So it will use these 10 bits to index into the outer page table. Then whenever it finds the base address of the inner page table, it will use these 10 bits to index into that page table, the inner page table. Then once it has found the real page table entry for the page, it will figure out the base address of the frame. Then it will use the 12 bits over here to figure out how far into the frame the physical memory location is, and then it will generate the physical address that will go into the physical memory, and we can read or write to that physical memory. Here is a bigger picture of the segmentation unit, and as I said before, the selector has the segment number, either it is GDT or LDT, and there is a couple of bits for protection. So we look at a descriptor table and we use the segment number to kind of index into that and figure out which segment it is and find its segment descriptor. The segment descriptor will give us the base address of the segment. We take the offset, we add them, and we get a 32-bit linear address over here. and this is the paging structure. So here we use two levels of paging for smaller pages, because smaller pages can have lots of page table entries. So we need two levels over here. And we will look at later what happens for 4 MB pages just a little bit after this. So we use the 10 bits over here to index into the page directory, right? So the page directory is stored somewhere in memory, and the CR3 register in IA32 actually points to the base of the page directory. So we use the 10 bits of the logical address over here, or the linear address which the segmentation unit gives us, to index into the page directory, or you can also call this the outer page table. And then when we find the base address of the page table, we go there. Then we use these 10 bits over here, which are allocated for the inner page table. Then we index into the inner page table over here. Then we get the base address of a page. Then we use the offset to index into the page, and we find our memory location. But if 4 megabyte pages are being used, then we don't need two levels of page tables, because only a very few pages like these would be there. So we can just get away with using one level of page tables, and we can just use the page directory over here. The outer page table is just enough. So since the offset is now bigger for 4 megabyte pages, because the pages are bigger, you need a larger offset. So the number of bits that are used for the page number have now decreased. So we just need 10 bits for the page number, and the rest of it is just the offset into the 4 megabyte page. So we use these 10 bits to index into the page directory, and whatever page table entry we find over here, that will give us the base address of this 4 megabyte page, and we can use this offset to offset into that page. And here we briefly look into the ARM architecture. So ARM is the dominant mobile platform chip. It is used by Apple iOS and Google Android and other devices. So it is very modern, it is very energy efficient, and at the time when these slides were being prepared, that is 2013, only the 32-bit variant of these chips were present. When I'm recording this video today, we have already moved on to the 64-bit versions of these chips, but we will only look at how the 32-bit version of this chip worked as far as paging is concerned. So the 32-bit versions of these CPUs have both 4 KB and 16 KB pages. They can also have 1 MB and 16 MB pages, and these are large pages and they are called as sections. So for these small pages, we do two levels of paging, but for these bigger pages, those are sections, we just need one level of paging. This was also the case for Intel. When we used to use 4 MB pages, we would have just one level of indexing into the page table. But when we would be using 4 KB pages, we would have one outer page table, which was the page directory, and an inner page table, which we just used to call the page table. So there are two levels of TLBs. Also, the outer level has two micro TLBs, one for data and one for instruction. And the inner is the single main TLB, which does both data and instructions. So we first check the inner one, and if there is a miss, we check the outer one. And if we miss both, we do a page table walk, as in we look at the real page tables and we populate the TLBs and we move on. So thank you for staying with me for this chapter. It was a long chapter. And in the next chapter, we will be studying virtual memory management. We will try to explain the concepts of demand paging, page replacement algorithms, and allocation of page frames. We will discuss the principles of the working set model. We will try to examine the relationship between shared memory and memory mapped files. And we will try to also explore how kernel memory is managed. Thank you.